Don't scroll past this. What you're about to hear is the story they never wanted told. Ibrahim Traoré just did something no one saw coming. In a world where African nations are told to wait, borrow, beg, and obey, he stood on a runway and unveiled a shock to the global system. A made-in-Burkina jet. Not bought, not gifted, not assembled from foreign kits, but built, engineered, painted, and tested on Burkina soil by Burkina hands. The moment that jet's wheels hit the tarmac, 1,000 narratives collapsed. They told us Africa couldn't build planes, that aerospace was a Western domain, that high technology, aviation, precision manufacturing, these were not for us. But Traoré just crushed a myth that's lasted for decades. And that plane? It wasn't just metal and turbines, it was proof. Proof that the lie we've been told, that Africa must always import innovation, was never true. Because buried under sanctions, loans, consultants, and lectures was something far more dangerous than poverty, potential. And now that potential has wings. But what makes this story more explosive is what came next. Traoré didn't just launch a jet, he launched a truth. In that same unveiling, he exposed documents showing how, as early as the 1960s, African countries had submitted designs, blueprints, and patent applications for aircraft. Prototypes were sabotaged. Engineers disappeared. Funds evaporated. In one declassified report, Western intelligence agencies marked early African aviation initiatives as containment priorities. Translation? If Africa ever took off, literally, it would be harder to control economically. They buried our airfields in red tape, flooded our schools with development advisors, told our brightest students to study abroad, then trapped them in student visa cycles. For decades, they made sure our skies stayed empty, until now, because this jet didn't come from nowhere. It came from a decision Traoré made early in his leadership, that Burkina Faso would not only grow food, it would grow capacity. That sovereignty wasn't just about borders, it was about blueprints. And so, quietly, he launched the National Aerospace Initiative. No fanfare, no flashy conferences, just 23 engineers, 7 machinists, in a hangar on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. They worked with scrap. They reverse-engineered grounded aircraft. They watched open-source tutorials, built 3D printers from recycled tech, and sourced materials from local industry. It was messy, it was slow, but it was theirs, and now it flies. If this story already shifts the way you see Africa, like this video and comment, we build the sky. Because what comes next isn't just about planes. It's about who gets to dream and who gets to define what's possible. They said it couldn't be done. That a landlocked nation with no legacy in aerospace, no billion-dollar research fund, no elite universities or global engineering firms could never build a functional aircraft from scratch. But they didn't count on belief. Belief not just from Ibrahim Traoré, but from welders, mechanics, electricians, and university dropouts who refused to accept the idea that their brilliance was only valid if it came with a Western certificate. What Traoré understood was simple. Africa doesn't lack talent. It lacks permission. And he wasn't asking for any. That's why the aircraft wasn't built in secret, but in silence. No press releases, no imported advisors, just raw steel, open minds, and long nights. The team built their own wind tunnel using scrap fans. They developed composite materials using plant-based polymers mixed with recycled plastics. They didn't just copy, they innovated. Because necessity, when paired with pride, breeds solutions. They tested wings in storm tunnels, wrote code for flight software on secondhand laptops, calibrated sensors using tools meant for farm tractors. They turned what the world discarded into what the world now cannot ignore. And it wasn't just a technological victory, it was cultural. Because for the first time, Burkina children looked up at the sky and saw something that belonged to them. Not a passing foreign jet, not a symbol of escape, but a declaration of presence. One mechanic said, "We didn't build it to leave, we built it to stay." And that shift of mindset, of meaning, is what gives this story its true altitude. But it didn't stop at the hangar. Traoré instructed the Ministry of Education to integrate aerospace fundamentals into high school curriculums. New textbooks were printed with diagrams of locally built fuselages. Young students toured the test site and touched the nose of the aircraft with wide eyes. Teachers asked them not just to memorize formulas, but to question the world that told them they could never build. And they did. A 14-year-old girl from Kaya sent in a redesigned sketch of the jet's tail rudder. Engineers reviewed it, they implemented it, and it worked better than the original. In Traore's Burkina Faso, education is no longer theoretical. It's applied, real, alive. Because you can't raise a generation with pride if all they see is imported power. You must let them touch it, shape it, build it. That's why this jet matters. Not because it flies, but because it lands in the minds of the young and in the hearts of the people, and in the narrative of what Africa truly is when it is allowed to create without permission. If this story inspires you, comment it from ground to glory, and like this video to push this story further, so that the next child who dreams of building doesn't have to wait another generation to begin. When the news broke that Burkina Faso had built and tested its own jet, the Western world didn't know how to respond. First came denial. Headlines referred to it as a stunt, an unsanctioned prototype, or an experimental concept. Then came mockery. Online pundits joked about banana-powered aircraft and questioned how a country without luxury airports could possibly design anything that flies. But what followed next was silence, the kind of silence that settles when something undeniable has taken place. Because the aircraft didn't just exist. It flew. It landed. It was real. And reality is harder to control than perception. What scared global institutions wasn't the plane itself. It was what the plane represented, a collapse of monopoly. Because for over a century, aerospace has been gatekept, guarded by licensing bodies, protected by intellectual property laws, and weaponized through trade deals. It wasn't just a field of study, it was a fortress. And Traore didn't break in. He built a new door, quietly, locally, successfully. And that terrified those whose power depends on Africa never realizing its own capacity. The secret that was buried for decades had now surfaced. African innovation has never been lacking. It has been locked out. Locked out by underfunded schools, by visa systems that drain talent, by NGOs that distract rather than develop, by aid that demands allegiance over advancement. But once that jet lifted off the ground, none of those barriers could deny what was already in motion. Traore knew this was more than flight. It was narrative warfare. And so he leaned in. A national broadcast aired a full documentary showing every step of the process, from sourcing the raw aluminum to the hand-stitched cockpit seats made by local women's cooperatives. It wasn't just a victory lap, it was a lesson. This is how you build, the voiceover said. Not with foreign approval, but with national belief. The people responded. Farmers sent messages of support. Retired mechanics showed up at testing sites to volunteer. Children began drawing jets beside their names. And more importantly, other nations started asking questions. How much did it cost? What materials were used? How long did it take? Could it be replicated? The answers were shocking. Less than $1.2 million. 92% locally sourced components. 19 months. And yes, it could be replicated. That's when whispers turned to worry in Western capitals. Because if Burkina Faso could do this without aid, what would stop Ghana, Uganda, or Malawi from doing the same? If belief could fly here, where else could it land? If knowledge could be rebuilt from memory, not manuals, what would happen to the global knowledge hierarchy that kept Africa on the bottom rung? The answer was already in the air. And as that jet sliced across the sky, so too did a deeper truth. Africa is not rising because it is being helped. Africa is rising because it has stopped asking for permission. If you feel that truth, comment, "We fly without fear." Like this video and let it reach someone who still thinks innovation only comes with permission. As Burkina Faso's jet thundered over the capital skies, its echo carried far beyond its borders. It was no longer just a Burkina Faso achievement, it was a continental awakening. From Kenya to Sierra Leone, social media lit up with a question that had long been buried beneath foreign aid brochures and colonial textbooks. If they can build that, why can't we? For years, African youth had been taught that aviation was for others, that real innovation came in from abroad, that their role was to use, not to design. But now, they were seeing a different narrative unfold before their eyes, not through TED Talks or NGO workshops, but through motion, metal, and noise. Traore's jet didn't just fly, it screamed across the African sky, "We are no longer waiting." Young people responded with fire. Engineering students in Rwanda started local drone clubs. University labs in Nigeria began repurposing vehicle parts for turbine experiments. A group of teenagers in Ghana crowdfunded to build a wind tunnel made from recycled pipes. And everywhere, the words "Made in Africa" took on new weight. It was no longer branding, it was a blueprint. Meanwhile, regional governments took note. Officials from Togo, Benin, and Mali requested visits to the Burkina Faso aerospace hub. Not just to watch, but to learn. They toured the hangars, spoke with the machinists, touched the material, and left with new ideas, not about how to copy Traore, but how to ignite their own industrial flames. Because the truth was now obvious. It wasn't about jets. It was about ownership. And ownership isn't something you inherit from the West. It's something you grow one system at a time. But while Africa looked to Burkina Faso with admiration, global institutions looked with unease. Think tanks scrambled to write reports on unexpected industrial activity in the Sahel. Defense analysts debated whether the aircraft posed regional balance shifts. Trade bodies feared that localized tech would lead to protectionist trends. Translation, they were scared. Scared that a new era of African leadership was emerging, one that built instead of borrowed, one that flew instead of fled. And Traore knew this. He didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He kept building. Quietly, his administration announced plans for a second model, slightly larger, more efficient, capable of regional flights between African capitals. A sky bus, he called it, designed not for war, but for work. A machine of peace, one that would carry goods, students, scientists, one that would connect, not divide. Because in his vision, the skies weren't for showing power. They were for sharing it. That's why this jet matters. Not just because it broke altitude, but because it's building attitude. A new attitude across the continent that says, we don't need to prove ourselves to anyone. We just need to prove ourselves to each other. If that resonates with you, comment "Africa Connects." Like this video and help spread the belief that when one country flies, a whole continent lifts. Traore knew the jet was just the beginning. For every wheel that lifted off the runway, he saw 10 more opportunities grounded by belief. His real war wasn't against the West. It was against the mindset that said Burkina Faso must always be a receiver, never a creator. That's why he moved fast. While global analysts debated what the plane meant, he unveiled his next move, a continental aerospace parts network, sourced, built, and traded entirely within Africa. Not just planes, but possibilities. He called it the Ground-to-Sky program, and its mission was bold, to make every component, every bolt, every chip needed for regional aviation accessible from African soil. That meant jobs for welders, contracts for chemists, tasks for textile experts, and labs for electronics students. It meant that every village could potentially feed into the sky, and the people embraced it. Women's co-ops began manufacturing seat fabrics and harnesses using traditional Burkina Faso weaving patterns. Retired goldsmiths were trained to mill titanium. Even pottery collectives repurposed kilns for ceramic coating processes. The entire nation became a supply chain, not for someone else's empire, but for their own skies. Meanwhile, Traore announced the establishment of the Burkina Faso School of Aeronautical Engineering. Tuition-free, located in a repurposed colonial administration building, symbolic of how far the country had come. The first class enrolled 200 students from 8 African nations. Their motto, "We design what we fly." But it wasn't just about building parts. It was about building partnerships. Traore flew not to Europe, but to African capitals, Kinshasa, Addis Ababa, Lusaka, offering open-source designs, training blueprints, and a shared vision. His offer was simple. Let us rise together. Let Africa own the altitude. Some accepted, Others hesitated, but none could deny what was happening, because Burkina Faso had done what no textbook expected. It had converted borrowed pain, $150 million of debt, into industrial pride, into movement, into machines, into a model that proves sovereignty is not just what you defend, it's what you design. But not everyone cheered. International finance bodies issued cautious statements. We hope this initiative aligns with regional integration frameworks. Others warned of over-militarization of national ambition, but they misunderstood everything. There was no militarization. There was mobilization. Traore wasn't building weapons. He was building willpower. And that's more dangerous to the old world than any fighter jet. Because when a poor nation discovers its power, it doesn't just rise. It teaches others how to rise too. That's why this movement keeps spreading. Because it's not built on dollars. It's built on direction. It doesn't need investors. It needs imagination. If you believe in that kind of future, comment from soil to sky. Like this video and let more people see what Africa creates when it stops exporting dreams and starts building them right where it stands. As the Made in Burkina jet circled the skies, its shadow reached further than just airfields. It began casting itself on the walls of art studios, into the minds of musicians, across classroom blackboards and dinner table debates. What Traore had done was no longer just political or economic. It was cultural. Because a nation that flies begins to see itself differently, and that self-image ripples into everything. Local artists painted the aircraft over maps of Africa, its wings stretching across borders, symbolizing unity without permission. Fashion designers created entire collections inspired by the jet's smooth lines and national colors. A Burkinabe poet wrote, "We no longer chase planes with our eyes, we build them with our hands." That shift in imagination, that awakening of pride, was the real revolution. Because for decades, Africans were taught to admire progress from afar, to applaud foreign innovation, to dream in imported images. But now they were seeing that greatness could have their name on it, their language engraved in the metal, their soil fueling the takeoff. In schools, teachers replaced colonial-era examples with local references. Physics students studied the jet's flight path. Literature students wrote essays on the symbolism of Burkinabe wings. Even young children began sketching their own flying machines. Not as fantasies, but as plans. This wasn't propaganda, it was reclamation, reclaiming the right to be extraordinary, reclaiming the space to imagine. And that terrified the global narrative keepers. Because a continent that starts to believe in itself becomes much harder to manage. But Traore didn't care about management. He cared about momentum. That's why his next move wasn't military. It was musical. He commissioned a national anthem remix using traditional instruments and modern production, paired with sounds recorded from the actual jet engine. The song played on every station, in markets, in taxis, in headphones. It wasn't just a track, it was a triumph. One that said, "We are no longer passengers, we are the pilots now." Meanwhile, African diaspora communities from Paris to Toronto began hosting Burkina Build Nights, events where engineers, artists, and thinkers brainstormed ways to replicate the model in their own homelands. They weren't waiting for invitations. They were launching movements. And that was the most powerful export Burkina Faso had ever produced. Not gold, not cotton, not cocoa, but belief. Belief that we can design. Belief that we can build, belief that we don't have to be explained by others. We can speak for ourselves through machines, through music, through mastery. If that kind of pride makes sense to you, comment, "We are the pilots." Like this video and help share the real story of a continent lifting not just into the sky, but into its own identity. They couldn't ignore it anymore. What began as a local miracle had now become an international dilemma. Western media stopped laughing. Defense journals began analyzing. Development agencies issued cautiously worded reports. They called it technological nationalism, unauthorized aerospace emergence, and unstable innovation. But what they really meant was this: Africa has done something we didn't control. And that terrified them more than any weapon. Because they weren't scared of the plane. They were scared of the proof. Proof that without their funding, approval, or direction, a so-called poor country could build something precise, advanced, and globally symbolic. And if Burkina Faso could do it with a fraction of the cost and none of the noise, what did that say about the billions spent elsewhere that led to nothing but dependency? The answer was too uncomfortable to say out loud, so they whispered it through policy briefs. They ramped up diplomatic pressure. Trade representatives quietly warned African partners about repercussions for aligning too closely with Traoré's model. Aid programs were suddenly reviewed, but it was too late. The shift had begun, not just in Burkina Faso, but in minds across the continent. Because what Traoré had truly built was not just a machine. It was a mental escape route, a way out of the cage of low expectations, a way out of the doctrine that says you can dream, but not deliver. He shattered that doctrine with rivets, cables, code, and confidence. And the people felt it. Local mayors in distant provinces requested engineering workshops instead of road grants. Youth demanded practical tech programs over NGO dance campaigns. Even elders, long silenced by the memory of broken promises, began offering their wisdom to young builders, saying, "We knew this was always possible." The healing had begun, not from charity, not from aid, but from achievement. Real, tangible achievement born of focus, sacrifice, and unity. That's why no sanction could stop this. No article could discredit it, because it wasn't about the headlines. It was about the home ground. The factories running at night, the students skipping lunch to test designs, the farmers donating metal scraps, the communities lifting each other, not through slogans, but through screws, solder, and sweat. That kind of movement doesn't beg. It builds, and that's what makes it unshakable. If this part of the journey makes you proud, comment "We build anyway." Like this video and let it reach those still trapped in the lie that Africa must always ask. Because Burkina Faso just proved it can answer. The jet flew, but its shockwaves traveled deeper than radar could measure. In halls of power across Europe and North America, strategy teams scrambled. Reports began circulating with terms like Burkina disruption, Aero sovereignty risk, and contagious confidence. Their fear wasn't theoretical, it was structural, because for decades, Africa had been engineered to consume, not create, to adopt, not adapt, to remain grateful, not grounded. But Traoré's aircraft violated all of that. It was the ultimate contradiction to their narrative, a flying contradiction. And contradictions like that are dangerous. They don't just float in the air, they land in minds, in movements, in models. Because across the continent, leaders, quiet ones, bold ones, hesitant ones, began to wonder, what if our future isn't locked in policy binders, but in people? In Tanzania, a coalition of engineers pushed for a homegrown commuter drone project. In Namibia, the National University announced a joint program with agricultural mechanics to study aerodynamics using windmills. In Egypt, students wrote op-eds titled "Africa Can Fly." And they meant it, because Traoré didn't just raise a jet, he raised a standard, a new bar that said, "Progress is not what they send us, it's what we lift ourselves." Meanwhile, global think tanks released counter-narratives. They said, the Burkina model is not scalable. It's symbolic, it's risky, but they couldn't hide the data. Burkina Faso's education enrollment spiked. Rural migration reversed. Private sector manufacturing tripled. And something no algorithm could quantify had taken hold. Hope. Not the kind sold in donation commercials. The kind earned in late-night welding sessions. In trial and error coding. In paper sketches turned into 3D printed landing gear. The kind of hope that doesn't come from speeches. It comes from screws, from silence, from sacrifice. And through all this, Traoré never made it about himself. He kept the spotlight on the people, the builders, the dreamers, the backbone. He famously said during an interview, "If they forget my name but remember what we made together, we win." That humility, rare in any leader, was exactly why the movement kept growing. Because it wasn't about charisma, it was about capacity. And every Burkina Faso citizen could feel it in their bones. This wasn't a moment. This was a model. And more than that, it was a mirror, reflecting to all of Africa what had always been possible, buried beneath centuries of dismissal. And as that mirror spread, the old world flinched, because they knew if one plane built by belief could cause this much momentum, what would happen when the whole continent believed? If you feel that question deep in your spirit, comment "Africa believes." Like this video and let it remind someone that the sky was never the limit. It was the starting line. This was never just about a jet. It was about a jailbreak. A jailbreak from the mental, political, and economic cages designed to keep Africa grounded. They told Burkina Faso it was poor, too dry, too landlocked, too unstable. But Traore didn't just reject those labels. He rewrote the definitions. He didn't beg for a seat at their table. He built his own runway. And what took off wasn't just an aircraft, it was a new era. One defined not by imports, but by invention. Not by aid, but by agency. And now the world is watching a land they once dismissed become a reference point for the future. But what made it powerful wasn't just engineering, it was unity. The farmer who donated scrap metal, the student who coded flight software, the elder who remembered how colonial engineers dismantled early prototypes. All of them were part of this aircraft. Their fingerprints were on every bolt, their dreams stitched into the seatbacks. And when that jet lifted off, so did their dignity. But Traore knew the jet was just the beginning. It was a tool, not a trophy, a signal to his people. We can, we will, we are. And across the continent, that message is spreading. Not through slogans, but through blueprints, through hands-on training, through open-source designs and shared solutions. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, Traore offered harmony. In a system built on control, he planted cooperation. While others hoard knowledge, he distributed it. While others built walls, he opened doors. And that is why this movement cannot be reversed, because it is not dependent on him. It belongs to the people. To the youth waking up at dawn to test new flight modules, to the welders who whisper prayers before sealing turbine casings, to the mothers who pack lunches for engineering students who refuse to leave the country, to a nation that finally sees itself not as a problem to be solved, but as a power to be unleashed. And as global powers scramble to redefine their strategies, Burkina Faso does not scramble. It builds, calmly, boldly, continuously, because it knows that true freedom doesn't fly in overnight. It is built layer by layer, screw by screw, generation by generation. And now no one can unsee what has already taken flight. The age of waiting is over. The era of asking is gone. What comes next is creation, circulation, elevation. Africa is no longer on the runway. It's in the sky. If this story has opened your eyes, moved your heart, or shifted your beliefs, comment, Africa has launched. Like this video, subscribe, and share it. Because stories like this are not just content. They are correction. They are declaration. And they are only the beginning.